Good afternoon, everybody. I'm surprised that in the last panel, the room is still reasonably populated. Thank you all very much. My name is Dirk MATTEN. I am a colleague of Cindy's at York University. I'm in the business school and have a chair in corporate social responsibility. My panelists are first off Patricia KOVAL to my right. She will lead off our discussion. We kick off with statements by all three panelists. She's a retired partner at Tory. Second, then, we will have Laura Zizzo from Zizzo Strategy, obviously your own company. And third, then, will be Paul Booth, Commissioner, Canada's Ecofiscal Commission. You find more details on the CVs of the panelists, so we don't need to waste our time with that. But I encourage the panelists to refer to your own background and experience in as much as it puts weight on what you are intending to share with us. Now, for me, it's a very big privilege to be at a conference of lawyers. I am just from the shallow end of science, management. And the nice thing, I've been working in these issues now for nearly 30 years, is that once the lawyers become involved, something is about to be taken seriously. And that is certainly the case if you look at a lot of the classic CSR, corporate social responsibility issues. I often get the question, especially in the media, do you believe in CSR as a chair in CSR? And I find that always an odd question, because would you ask a professor of forensic psychiatry who studies serial killers whether he believes in his subject? Okay. I don't know if you get that. Serial killers. CSR is an interesting phenomenon, but we have to be very honest that with regard to what we are talking about today, these voluntary initiatives by corporations haven't really added that much. We haven't really made the inroads. And the reason is that corporate social responsibility is only allowed to happen in companies, and that's practice, but also management, mainstream management doctrine, in four situations, in four cases. Either you can make more money with it, hybrid cars, electric cars, organic food, that kind of stuff. Second, you can reduce costs. That's what the Walmarts are doing. I mean, if you reduce your energy consumption, contribute to climate change, fine, you can do it. Third, you can manage risks. Now, that's an area we have been talking about quite a bit today. And third and fourth, this more broader thing about the license to operate. But these are all business case related scenarios, more or less short term. And of course, the nature of the beast shows very clearly that unless markets translate these long-term incentives into those short-term incentives markets can process, a simply voluntary approach, as CSR represents it, doesn't do it. So in that sense, thinking about more mandatory ways, and even mandatory ways in the sense that Sarah Barton outlined them, that voluntary initiatives by dint of market power can become mandatory, and all these soft law and hybrid forms of regulations. That's where lawyers come in, and that's often also historically with regard to other issues of business responsibility, we have seen progress and we have seen change. In that sense, I'm very excited about today's panel, and I pass it over to you, Patricia, to lead us off.
Sure. Well, when I spoke with Cynthia about the panel today, we thought it would be interesting to share a little bit of perspective on again, just to open this up on the question of whether climate change really is on the business agenda today. And I shared with Cynthia a little bit of my experience over the last 10 years because, like a couple of other folks in the audience, I'm also one of those, well, I don't want to use the word dinosaurs, but we've been around for a long time in the climate space, and we were present when it really exploded into the public realm in 2005, 2006. We were active, for many, many years, and here we are, in my case, over 10 years later. And what I'm really going to say is, looking back over time, I actually think climate change is on the business agenda. In 2007, I got particularly involved in the question of climate change, the legal issue around climate risk, in 2007 when the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy commissioned my then law firm Tory's to do a comprehensive legal analysis on climate risk, or more specifically, the question we were asked to look at was whether legal liability might result for a variety of different players, if you will, from the failure to take climate change and climate risk into account. Some of you, just backing up for a second, will remember the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy. It was chaired last by Bob Page and helmed by David McLaughlin as the CEO. From 1987 to 2013, when its funding was cut by the Conservative government, it really was one of Canada's leading advisory groups on the issue of integrating economic prosperity and environmental conservation. And in the last years of its focus, it was almost singularly on climate change and the options available to governments and other stakeholders to adapt or mitigate. So our report on legal liability was actually published in late 2008. As a companion to one of the NRTEE reports. That specific one was on the effects of climate change on the North, infrastructure and industry in the North. And our report was indeed a comprehensive one. We looked at the gamut of legal liability, potential sources, I should say, of legal liability, ranging from, of course, statutory sources right through common law, negligence, nuisance, strict liability. And we concluded then, and of course it's no surprise, and certainly continues to be the conclusion that others have reached, that there certainly is potential legal liability for those in a position of responsibility who fail to take climate change or climate risk into account. And the corollary to that is that the potential for legal liability should be regarded as a significant driver of climate change adaptation. So what happened after that? Well, really that was from 2007 really right through to today. I and others in my firm who participated in the report have basically advised businesses and lectured extensively to various groups of stakeholders on this subject. And looking back, I was looking back last night I have on my computer some of the presentations, and it was really a very, very broad list of businesses, governments, and those who advise business and government. So countless municipalities in Ontario, municipal planners, and the Canadian Federation of Municipalities, professional associations, including especially engineers and the auditing profession, stormwater management specialists, disaster management specialists, the Canadian Electricity Association, various provincial government consortia and specialists on climate change. And looking at Dave, many presentations with Dave, Toronto Region Action Group on extreme weather resilience, the Sanford Fleming Forum on critical infrastructure, lots of developers and people in the construction industry, property and casualty insurers, and of course the standard setters, CSO. CSO was actually part of the initial, they were also doing a part of the report at the same time that we were doing our part for NRTEE. So what have I seen as a result of 10 years later and the process of 10 years? Is climate change, and in particular, is adaptation or the need to take into account climate risk and adaptation, are those on the business agenda? And my own observations after all of these talks and all of this consultation is that while not everyone that I spoke to over the years particularly liked what I had to say all of the time, most have appeared to basically embrace it and to act on it. Now, it's not it's not always transparent when you look at a business decision made by a municipality with respect to a long-lived asset that they took climate risk into account. But by and large, what I've seen is businesses treating climate risk as one of the, basically the risk aspects they need to take into account in their business analysis. It becomes part of their cost-benefit analysis. So professional, just to go through what I've seen, professional engineers, of course, these are the people who are certifying infrastructure projects and certifying, if you will, maintenance and repair schedules for critical infrastructure. The engineers actually were very proactive in this area. They asked for more and more information. They set up professional training programs. They included it in their CPD for basically for their engineers going forward. Good result. Municipal planners, disaster management specialists, and owners of critical infrastructure. Again, what I saw over and over, what I've seen over and over again is them taking climate risk into account when they are making decisions about ownership, operation, and maintenance of critical infrastructure, and particularly long-lived assets. It's part of their risk calculus. Obviously, it's a risk calculus. They make business decisions, including all of various elements of risk, and they put a price, or at least a notional price, on the risk elements, and they make their decisions accordingly. But by and large, that's what I've seen happening at least over the last 10 years. Businesses with physical assets, particularly in the north, I'm talking about mining companies that have tailings dams or rail assets or pipelines, roads, et cetera, where they're going to be particularly susceptible to, if you will, problems as a result of the melting of the permafrost and more frequent severe weather effects. I began to regularly see them including that in their basically in their operating and capital expenditure calculus for their assets. Other examples, the property and casualty insurers, we all know that they've been all over this issue, many of them. The insurers themselves and their reinsurers, they've been incorporating climate change risk into their pricing and business models, and some have gone even further. And again, we've seen examples of it, of effectively funding think tanks and other institutes that are studying climate risk, funding organizations that have been championing the design of commercial and residential buildings that are going to be better equipped to deal with climate extremes, and basically adding to the body of thinking on climate change and the evolving pressures on governments to take these issues into account and to modify building codes. And of course, building codes, the CSO were there at the table back in 2007. We have seen attention to building codes since then. We had the National Research Council put out their announcement earlier this year that they're going to be amending building codes across the country. So this is a process that's taken time, but it's happening. So building codes are being amended. And with that, the developers and the folks in the construction industry, the initial response I used to get from the developers was, we didn't like to hear the warning that they might be potentially unable to shelter behind the defense of saying we built code, or we bid based on code, when they were relying on codes that are known to be, or which frankly ought to be known to be, outdated in view of the increasing amount of climate data. It's not something that they'll shout from the rooftops, but it's definitely something that most developers will quietly tell you, yes, they are factoring climate risk and risk dealing with outdated codes into their bidding processes. It may not be the most significant factor, and it may not change their decision of what to bid, because ultimately developers are in bidding processes to win bids, and they might be prepared to take greater risk in order to win. But they're factoring climate change and legal liability risk into that calculus. Municipalities, happy to say, are taking much tougher stances on, for example, granting new building approvals in areas where the floodplain is extant, or some broader swath of land is affected by potential flooding. And the databases of the conservation authorities who are working with municipalities and often instrumental in working with the developers in the construction industry, well, they're just so much deeper now. The collection of data has continued on an unrelenting basis. The data's much better, and the availability of the climate data is much better. So I've seen much broader audiences for climate data. So I would say, in short, I think climate change and certainly the evaluation of climate risk as a business risk is something, I'm happy to say, is on the agenda, or certainly appears to be on the agenda.
Thank you, Patricia. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Don't be fooled by the slide's title, but I saw all the great slides earlier today, so I thought I'll put some together. So here we go. So I'm Laura Zizzo. I have another 10-year anniversary. The NRT report came out that was also the year I graduated from law school. And I no longer practice law full time, right? I realized that it's actually more about the opportunities around climate change that we can focus on, not just the risks and not just the regulatory compliance issues, and how do we get people jazzed about thinking about the future, not just thinking about how bad it's going to be, but how we can work towards the transition. So what Cynthia asked me to talk about as one of the only other millennials on the panel is how do we think about what leading companies have been doing and what are some of the work that I'm doing with the companies that we work with. So we have a team, I'm trying to walk the walk of what professional service providers need to be doing in light of climate change. So on our team, we have lawyers, engineers, accountants, and business professionals. And we're trying to provide strategic advice to clients, both in the private and public sector, on what they need to be thinking about in light of climate change, answering the question, what does climate change mean to me? So when Sarah put up her slide on the World Economic Forum earlier today, I said, that's the slide I use when I start talking to CEOs, C-suites, boards of directors on climate risk. And it helps to kind of focus the mind. Yes, it's still a risk decision, but it's talking about how does your company fit into the response to this risk? And that is often a discussion around opportunities. So when we talked about what are the companies that are leading and what are they doing, insurance companies and long-term investors. A lot of our clients are in the real estate space because they're talking about assets that are in the decades. Or insurance companies who are thinking about how are we going to insure and have money available when people need it in 40, 50, 60 years. So they're starting to get this. When you put up a slide like this and you say the top right-hand corner of this World Economic Forum slide on the worst economic risks that have the highest likelihood and impact are all climate related, the top 5 are all climate related, it kind of focuses the mind on what the opportunities could be. This is also a slide that's been alluded to. So this is the insured losses in Canada over time related to catastrophic events. This is normalized for 2016 data. This is not inflation. This is we have more catastrophic events in Canada, and the insurance industry is seeing, as Sarah said, over $1 billion a year on the regular. And extreme events are causing extreme payouts. And we know that insured losses only account for about 1/3 of the actual losses felt in the economy. So how are we going to do this? So talking about this to some of Canada's largest insurance companies as our clients, they see the opportunity. So although we can say we may have an uninsurable market, they also say we are the risk managers of this market. So how can we be part of the transition? So one of the things I wanted to mention about what leading companies are doing is the fact that we are getting invited to more board meetings. And luckily there are more board meetings with joint committees with the Sustainability Committee and the Risk Committee. The problem that has come up, I think, in discussions today is who owns this issue within an organization? And it's challenging for me trying to grow a business in an area that doesn't exist, right? I'm like, who do I talk to? Who's my client? In every single company, it's a different person. So we have done some work with Property Management Company, one of the largest property management companies in Canada. The client there internally was the business continuity specialist, the risk function. And the discussions that has come up today is, when do we need to be worried about this? So they wanted us to overlay what the best science on climate change has meant for where their properties are, where their critical assets are within the organization. So we did this really cool map using technology showing like this is the regions and these are the climate impacts, and here's where all your company has exposure. And I thought it was such a great report, you know, like really proud of it. And then she says, but what do I tell my board about next year? And I said, well, I'm not a weather forecaster, right? And then I'm trying, how do I deal with this? I'm sending the difference between climate and weather. NASA can explain this to you. And then I looked at the list of impacts that I said they need to be worried about over the next 7 to 15 years. And I said, geez, in our interviews with your managers, every single one of these impacts has come up. You need to think about it now. You needed to think about it yesterday. We need to stop thinking about climate change as something that is long-term. And we need to speak the language of the risk managers about today. And I've been on this slide for a really long time, which means that you know that I didn't prepare. Okay, so what are these slides? But I thought I was going to talk about. So Pat talked a little bit about the Canadian Electricity Association. So this is an example of some of the work that we've done for them, saying, what are the actual legal liabilities? How do we start engaging with your C-suite around disclosure, negligence, public safety? Where are the regulatory developments? And start to think about including those types of risk analysis in the strategy and planning. This has also been discussed. So I wanted to show that although we think of what is material, so in Canada, who are the leading companies that have been doing stuff on climate change? And I think they can really be put into 3 main categories. Those that have heavy resources and exposure, those that have longer term financial interests, I've talked about that, but also those that have a cultural ambition. So you'll often hear about MEC, Mountain Equipment Coma. You'll hear about Canadian Tire. They've tried to figure out, and they've done some great work in trying to actually set metrics and targets around the carbon content of what they're selling, that sort of thing. So, but there's a cultural reason that they're doing this. But we have probably 100% in Canada of the capital markets impacted by material climate risks. There's not a lot of leadership across the board. But we are seeing rapidly shifting expectations, and companies are starting to take note. You can put this sort of a slide up in front of institutional investment managers, or those that are the investor relations within a large corporation. They say, I didn't know about this. So there's a lack of education. But they also say, and this is true in Canada, my investors are coming to me and saying we're spending too much time on sustainability. So those in the room here are kind of singing from one side of the tune, but we've also heard our potential clients say to us, I get that that might be true, but there is not general education in the marketplace that this is something we should be thinking about, and our investors think that we're actually putting too much on sustainability. So this is a real challenge about education across the board. So working with CPA, we're really happy that we actually were able to add to that education by this report of the 75 reporting issuers. Some of the main themes of the report were that the majority of companies in Canada are saying something about climate change, but most of them do not include financial metrics or targets. They did not provide significant context, and these are my words, and the lack of comparability over time and across organizations. 79% of the companies we looked at were making climate-related disclosures to varying degrees. 31% of companies made disclosures related to physical risks of climate change, but none of those disclosures around physical risks had a financial aspect to it. But I remember that slide a couple ago where we showed like the insurance risks and catastrophic, so it's just not being translated. So what are some leading companies doing? I'll go back. I wanted to talk about Aviva. International leader from an insurance sector on addressing this issue and responding to the task force and been part of task force. But what they're doing is not that, what's the word? I don't want to disparage it. Complicated? It's not that complicated. They're actually just saying, okay, we know climate change isn't an issue. So in our governance disclosure, we're saying we have 2 committee oversight managing climate risk. There's a board risk committee and there's a board governance committee, and they have specific oversights around climate risk. Pick the place where it's being governed and disclose it. and make sure it's on the agenda. That's what TCFD is asking to do. Climate change is highlighted as an emerging risk in the 2016 annual report and accounts, as it has been in previous years. Under strategy, so this is governance strategy, you know, the 4 pillars, risk management, metrics, and targets. They're saying, we closely monitor exposure to the sectors particularly exposed to transition risk, and we analyze it at a more granular level at the individual company level risk. We've been thinking about climate change in our strategy and our investment strategy. Here's how we do it, 2 paragraphs. Under risk management, they're saying we are focused on the 3 risk factors: physical, transition, and liability. We undertook focused engagement with our companies to understand what they're thinking, especially those in thermal coal or coal power generation on climate issues. We've met with 127 companies to discuss sustainability, governance, and climate change, and over that same period, we've supported 86.8% of climate-related shareholder resolutions. Metrics and targets. So they say they're building the possibility of extreme weather into planning to help understand impacts and ensure pricing is adequate. They have catastrophic event modeling, and they're supplemented by in-house disaster scenarios to quantify cross-class accumulation. They have heat maps related to ESG and proxy climate risk metrics, and they're targeting £500 million of annual investment in low-carbon infrastructure from 2015 to 2020. So there is some real leadership shown here, but you can see how part of that can be emulated without having, how are you identifying climate risks and opportunities, and and tell us the process that you're doing that, and simply explain it. So not everyone needs to do these really high-tech scenario analysis. Hopefully that will happen more and more, but there's some aspects of the leadership we're seeing from companies like Aviva that every organization can implement, and I think that's what Jane was trying to say earlier today as well. So on the issue of climate competent boards, we were talking about this. Competency does not mean expert, but it's the ability to ask questions and having enough information to know what questions to ask. So how do we get all the boards up to that level? And then we have to educate the management, right? Like, we have to educate the management so they can answer those questions. So the leadership in the companies I'm seeing are trying to get senior management more up to speed on these things. And Sarah mentioned the A4S, the Accounting for Sustainability, and the CFOs. Really interesting, because there's some CFOs saying, this is my issue. So I was giving one of these talks at Metrolinx, everyone knows Metrolinx in this room. And I was saying, this is no longer, what we've been hearing today, just the ESG and the communication section's problem. This is your CFO's problem. And I was really feeling fired up that day. And the CFO was in the room, who's also a member of A4S, and I didn't know him yet, and he came up and he was like, so I'm the CFO, and I agree with you. So it's happening in some of the largest organizations across the country, but there's a lot of room to go. You need to find that champion within the organization. So going back to that part, it is unclear, and maybe there's some work that we can all do on this. Who owns this issue within an organization? Because climate change is ubiquitous and it encompasses everyone. It's unclear who within an organization, other than the CEO, should be responsible. You can make an argument that it's the general counsel, or it's the chief risk officer, or it's the chief financial officer, or it's the chief operations officer, because all of those people have to have a strong handle on climate change to really protect the business interests. How do we communicate within companies to do this? This is a big challenge for all of us, and I think a lot of work needs to go into that and to empowering people within the organizations to know that it is their issue. And then, because this hasn't been mentioned yet, I just wanted to say that there is this roadmap for Canada that the UN put out about fiduciary duty and what should be doing, so directing everyone's attention to that, especially the regulators in the room. There's a lot of opportunity for some more action within the Canadian context and pushing on these issues. But hopefully, I've given some food for thought that business as usual is changing. Integrating climate risk into planning, operations, and management is required, and we need to think strategically about doing this. But the process is actually the most important thing. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Laura. Well,
Okay. Can I write on the,
please.
So my name's Paul Booth, and I'm on the Ecofiscal Commission, which is a group economists that are interested in applying economic instruments to try to tackle climate and other environmental problems. And we are funded by a group of private foundations led by the, okay. Right, okay, good, yep. Funded by a group of private foundations led by the Ivy Foundation. And why am I on the Ecofiscal Commission? Well, probably because I took a turn as Deputy Minister of Environment Canada. So this was a big issue for me for several years. So what I want to do, and the reason that I want to stand up if there's and write these numbers down, because very quickly I want to make you the smartest people in the room on Canadian climate change in 99% of the meetings that you're in, right? And if you, and I'm going to write these numbers down so you can write them down, and then you'll be the smartest. And also, I'll talk about what Cynthia asked me to do, and that is a little bit about how governments can work together to try to tackle this problem. And I will tell you that I am optimistic about our chances on this. In fact, I think the biggest climate change problem that we will face over the next 25 years will be adapting to the climate change that we've already caused, right? But in terms of mitigating what's going forward, I like our chances on that. So let's start in 2005. And I'm rounding these numbers off because, you know, to be the smartest in the room, you don't have to know the decimal places. Canada had emissions of about 750 megatons, right? And the reason we say 2005 is because that's the base year that we use for climate agreements. So fast forward to 2014, which is the latest year for which we actually have an estimate. And now we're down to about 723 megatons. Okay? So the first thing that we should recognize here is that between 2005 and 2014, the economy in real terms grew more than 20%, 20+%, and yet we're down about 3 or 4%. So, you know, you could say that our emissions per person and our emissions per GDP are already going in the right direction.
It needs to happen.
But the tough number is 2030, because we've promised in 2030 that we're going to be down to about 525. Right? And if you want to be a per capita person, you can be at about, I don't know, 22 or 23 tons per person here. Of course, population is growing, right? And now we're down to around 20, but where we have to go is to 14, right? Now, if you're a Quebecer, you can say, aha, we're already past 14. If you're in Ontario, you can say, we're already at 14. But of course, you know, the distribution of emissions per capita is going to be different depending on where you are in the country. So now you're already the smartest person in most meetings when it comes to Canadian climate change, because you know these simple numbers, right? So now what I want to do is talk a bit about a very important piece of research, not done by the Ecofiscal Commission, but used by the Ecofiscal Commission by a couple of people called Dave Sawyer and Chris Bataille. And they wrote a paper called Taking Stock, Opportunities for Collaborative Climate Action to 2030. A very geeky paper. So, I mean, unless you really want to to be expert in the 99th and 100th meeting, which is the one with the economists. I'm not suggesting that you need to memorize it. But basically, what they say is, to get to here, right, we need a carbon price of about $150 per ton, right? And right now, depending on where you are, we're at about between $20 and $30 per ton, right? So $20 per ton, pretty close. What was the latest climate auction in Ontario? About 18, I think, something like that. So this is kind of the neighborhood. Okay, and before you go, oh my God, how are we ever going to do it? You should know that, to put it in a thing that you can use, think about the price of gasoline, right? Every $30 on the carbon price, right, means 7 cents on a liter of gas. So if we were at 30, we need gas prices to go up by about 28 cents over the next 12 or 13 years. So kind of like 2 or 3 cents a year, gas prices will have to rise. Now, when you tell me 2 or 3 cents a year on a liter of gas, when gas is fluctuating 10 cents between Friday and Sunday, this starts to come into perspective. And this is why I think our chances are quite good of getting to the price that we need to meet our target, right? The promise that we made in Paris. I'm pretty optimistic about this. And I don't think that the 2 or 3 cents per liter per year is going to cause the economy to completely go into the ditch, right? But we know that this works because we've got experience from British Columbia, right? Who's had a carbon tax for a number of years, and that's where we get the estimate of 7 cents a liter per $30 of carbon price. And we've also seen the decline in emissions in BC. And in fact, it was a little bit more than we expected, because people don't just care about money. They actually, once they kind of wake up to climate change, like these directors that Laura's talking to and Dad's talking to, they actually want to do a bit more, right? So now, I mean, where I want to close is what governments can do together. So this 150 is based on the assumption that Ontario and Quebec continue to trade carbon with California, right? Western Climate Initiative, right? If we said can't do that, everything has to be done all by ourselves in Canada, then the estimate here goes up to about $220 a ton to meet our target. And the reason is simple. California has lower cost reductions, and remember, our goal should be to meet our target as efficiently as we can, to save as much money as we can hitting our target. So how does this affect Canadian governments? Well, there is an opportunity here for Canadian governments to work together. But it's not going to be easy. If we allowed trading between provinces, so instead of paying my carbon tax in BC, I could also get buy the lowest cost reduction available in Canada, including trading with Ontario and Quebec. Sawyer and Bataille says the price could go down to $100 a ton in 2030. So that's big. And in fact, if you turn that into dollars of GDP, it's north of $20 billion. $20 billion per year. Now, to a group of lawyers, $20 billion, it's not much, right? It's neither here nor there. And to be honest, you know, remember GDP right now is about 1.2 trillion. So 20 billion is not a big number compared to 1.2 trillion. And it's not a big number compared to our ability to estimate this with a lot of confidence. So I don't want you to go and say, I've got 20 plus billion to save, and I'll tell you how to do it with a lot of confidence, because we don't. We have to be humble about this. But this is how governments can work together. What's the catch? The catch is, if you're a carbon tax province, you're expecting to collect all this revenue and use it to do good things. And if you allow this trading, some of that revenue is going to leak out of your jurisdiction. So doing this might be good for a company in a carbon tax jurisdiction, but bad for the government, right? And to the extent that this trading caused prices to rise in other lower cost jurisdictions, it may make companies in those jurisdictions worse off. Who knows, right? But this is why this is not a slam dunk, because while it might be good for companies in some jurisdictions, it's almost certainly not going to be good for governments. And that's it. You're the smartest in the room.
We have a few minutes left for discussion. Let me just make a few comments before I kick it open, either to the panel and the audience. I think today's discussion was, I think, very useful in the sense to think and push our thinking with regard to what can be done to get corporations more engaged with climate change through the role and exposure of boards and directors on boards through the topic. And I think we have heard a lot of good ideas how that can be achieved, furthered, and what innovations we might think, especially in the legal sense, to do that. The problem, and I just reflect on the topic of our panel here, how does Canada compare and what more should governments do, is of course that if you look at environmental sociology, they would argue that climate change and reaching a low carbon economy and the risks of climate change we want to address with that are lifestyle risks. So they are risks that no individual actor in a society single-handedly can influence. So even if we get all the directors fired up about it, we are still not in a position to really address climate change because it's a lifestyle risk. We need to change the way we commute. We need to change the way we organize our food supplies, and so forth and so forth. And hence, the subtitle of the title, and I think Paul has already opened that discussion. We need collective action. Now, it's clear that government has to play a role, and let's not forget, as Canadians, that until 2 years ago, our Prime Minister was a climate change denier, right? And that legacy still sticks. We haven't talked at all about the oil sands, for instance, which used to be a huge driver of the economy. We haven't talked about the huge impact of Canadian agriculture as a key industry on climate change. We haven't even talked about the mining industry and the implication that has on global climate change. I think the tasks ahead, even if we follow these mapped out trajectories by Paul in a minute, the hurdles for Canada are massive. And my question to you is, where do you see potential for collective action? Because as we see very clearly in many other policy areas, it can't just only be government. It has to be business, it has to be forms of collective action. If you do a comparative look at how other countries and other contexts and regions have addressed it, and you can think of the European context, also about Japan. These are very different corporatist settings where all these decisions are, and the institutional infrastructure exists to collectively come to consensual agreements and arrangements around these social and environmental issues. I do not see that infrastructure in Canada. And in terms of performance on a comparative scale, I don't think that Canada really is already in a position to be that optimistic. Now, I put it here out, and Cindy asked me to take a little bit to also move the discussion to a little perspective. And Laura, you can't wait to say something.
Can't wait. Let's talk about mining. If we have the move to the electric vehicle situation that we need to be in, the mining sector wins in Canada, and we have to talk about how do we get more more copper. So, not carbon, less carbon. But when you talk to the mining sector about climate change, they're still talking about emissions reduction. Emissions reduction is important, of course, but that is not, I don't think, the most important climate-related implication for the mining sector. So we need to better educate on the whole suite of things, and I think it's a little bit less about the cultural needing to kind of take one for the team for climate action, and it's changing the conversation to how do we think about the future and all the good things about the future and how to survive in that future. And it's about, that's why, we talk about resiliency, and it's the ability to respond to shocks quickly and get back to functional. So I'm of the view that if we talk about being more opportunistic and thinking about the transition in that way, we'll get further along than thinking about how we have to suffer to deal with climate change. We've been talking about that for my whole life, and we've gotten nowhere. So let's start talking about something that people can get excited about and try to move towards, the transition that we need to see so that there is a future for my 6-year-old twin daughters, and we're not thinking about how bad their life is going to be and how to make it less bad. Let's think about where the opportunities are for the future. And of course, there's going to be a risk analysis, but we've done a really poor job about engaging innovation culture and engaging sort of what the future looks like.
So I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate, and actually coming back to your point about vehicles for collective action. Over the years, I think we've seen a lot of good work done by industry associations that have embraced the issues around climate change and have tried to look
Substantially
forward.
or rhetorically?
I think substantially. Again, just from my own experience looking, for example, trade associations for not necessarily the mining industry, but the electricity industry, certainly, the trade associations around the municipalities.
They have fought tooth and nail the Ontario Green Energy Act. I mean, that's just not what I see.
Yeah, I'm focused more on the climate change adaptation piece as opposed to green energy. I've seen a lot of...
Isn't that part of the discussion?
Maybe yes, maybe no. Certainly, if you look at adaptation from the perspective that they're looking at, these are industry associations. They're looking at in particular, the businesses. They're focused on their particular businesses, their particular risk profiles, and where the risks and opportunities are. And I think, to Laura's point, actually, I think into some of the industry associations, the trade associations, and also voluntary associations that have sprung up. There's a whole host of associations that have sprung up around resiliency and dealing with extreme weather events. And I think, so I actually take some solace, frankly, from the fact that there are like-minded individuals within various industry groups who have been, frankly, very interested in this issue, very interested in understanding it, and engineers, actually, in NAPEG, which is the trade association for engineers, probably one of the best examples of a very forward-thinking professional association, looking not only at the risks, and protecting their members, but looking at, what it means to the profession going forward, where the opportunities are. So I'm a little bit more sanguine that there are, if you look at these sorts of groups that have sprung up and these sorts of existing groups, I'm more sanguine that there are those mechanisms, and that there is, that people are looking at this from a forward-thinking perspective as opposed to simply a reactionary.
I guess I would draw your attention to the fact that Ontario closed its coal-fired electricity plants, and now Alberta is, and the only way Saskatchewan's can continue is if they have carbon capture and storage. This is a huge impact on our numbers. That's why our numbers are going in the right direction. The other thing is, and Environment Canada, of course, was, during my tenure, was involved in those coal regulations. The other ones that we worked on when I was there were the fuel efficiency standards. The fact that you can get into a vehicle that gives you 50 miles a gallon, right? The fact that, I can buy my Camry hybrid is competitive with internal combustion vehicles. All that is because of regulations on fuel efficiency that we put into case. I think that, and the transportation choices that people make. One of the things that struck me about the BC carbon tax experience was this, and I mentioned it to you, the fact that actually emissions declined by even more than people expected, than economists expected, right? For whom it's all about dollars and cents. And, the explanation that seems to be most persuasive is that the carbon tax in BC raised the salience of the climate change issue, and people started to do more. Like, maybe I should plan my trips when I'm getting into my car. Maybe I should be thinking about it's just short distance, I could walk or ride my bike. All these things, when the whole population starts to do them, adds up to some significant results. So, I think that we are moving in the right direction, and if we can maintain the support for carbon pricing, for example, and all the other things we're doing, and that's not a given, then we can get there. But I think that what we also need to do, especially in the corporate world, is tell governments there's no going back. We've got to stay the course and get this done.
I just have an observation. It's like being in a cultural time warp here for me because I've worked in the Netherlands and I've worked here. And culturally, I think we're sitting on this panel the very reason why Europe seems to be so much further ahead of us. Dirk here from Germany is just like, well, why can't we just, no, we're not doing as much as we could be doing. And in reality, I think he's right. And I think we need to think about that in terms of we're so polite as a culture. Let's just, I actually really loved that in the Netherlands, they were first to solve a lot of big problems because they just rolled up their sleeves and they were, brought opposites together. They did not get along and they just hammered it out. And I think we need to stop being so nice to each other and just get it all together and start working on the solution. And there's, and I see that culturally there's such differences, and we need to find a made in Canada solution that's going to really go fast. And I know there's some work, and Andrea's been working on it at Ivy. There's other organizations that are sort of looking at, what's been happening in Europe around the high-level expert group. We need to find something, and maybe that exact model isn't going to be it here, but we need to do something. We need to do it fast. And maybe we've been doing some things, but we need to really escalate it, and we need to get on the same platform and just, maybe there's I don't want to repeat myself, but we're doing some good things, but we need to do more, and we need to do it faster, and we need to all get into the same huddle together. And I think that's part of what's happened in Germany and Europe more broadly.
That's probably a good summary. I hope, Cindy, you have put in my gift bag something stronger than chocolate. We had a wonderful panel, but I've never been in a situation where I disagreed virtually with everything every single panelist said. And that makes moderating, of course, a little bit hard. And I don't want to appear as a smug European. I think Europe has similar problems, and what happens there is also not all good. And I think Canada has a certain structural advantage. It's a small country, population-wise, but it's a huge country space-wise. Yes. I'm just coming back from a trip out west to Vancouver, Calgary, and Edmonton in 3 days, and that just gave me again an impression how much unspoiled, uninhabited space there is. Compare that to other parts of the world, Japan or so. Anyhow, I think this was a very useful conference we had, also a very useful panel. In the sense,
even though he disagrees.
No. I mean, I'm serious. No, I'm not facetious. In the sense to assess where we are and where to go. And I think that I agree with Paul and I agree with the panel that Canada has made some interesting steps. I think most notably by electing a different government 2 years ago. That certainly helps. But I think in many ways, I wish that Paul's optimism really gains momentum and that we actually see the progress everybody is seeing at the horizon. So thank you very much.
What? I'm not saying that I'm not happy with anything that's happened. We're just saying.
Sydney, what was that?
Perfect, Sean. Okay, well, I think I can't say it any better than the combination of Catherine and Dirk. I think that you are the co-chairs now of our committee, so that this is all not just good, polite talk, but what are the next steps, and who do we need to reach? What are the leverage points? And, let's make this happen. I have been shameless in promoting a book to everyone. Andrea has now heard this speech a couple of times. Keith Ambechur suggested it to Ed Waitzer, who is my colleague at Osgood, as well as a partner at Steichman's, who suggested it to me. Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, Kate Raworth. Senior fellow at Oxford, senior fellow at Cambridge, economist who worked for Oxfam for 10 years. And she's just, I think, got it right. It's about redesigning the way we are living, exactly as Dirk said. So I want to conclude by reading one short paragraph about what one city did, and possibly Toronto is also doing something like this. This is the city of Oberlin in Ohio, who decided that in 2009 that they would become one of America's first climate-positive cities by sequestering more carbon dioxide than it produces. The initiative aims to grow 70% of the city's food locally, conserve 20,000 acres of urban green space, and revive local culture in a community, creating enterprise and jobs to make it possible. Okay, so that was their determination in 2009. By 2015, college and city-run buildings were powered by 90% renewable energy. A growing proportion of food for the city's university, high schools, hospitals, and government offices were sourced from local growers. Cultural life is reviving thanks to a new performing arts center in the city's Green Arts District, and environmental education is now built into the public school curriculum. David Orr, executive director of the Oberlin Project, says, our aim is to full spectrum sustainability. We aim to recalibrate prosperity with the way that ecosystems work and what they can actually regenerate. So it's designing economic systems using the principles of environmental systems. And that, I think, is where we have to go if we're going to be going as fast as we need to go. Because the Paris Agreement is a fantastic market signal. It is a fantastic accomplishment, but it has us on a track, at least the country's commitments to it has us on a track to 2.7 degrees increase. So we need to do more, and we need to do it faster. We welcome, this is the beginning of a discussion. CCLI is thinking about legal tools, but there are other tools, accounting, directors, moms on boards who ate the chocolate. I like that. I just, invite everyone who is interested to continue to cooperate and communicate. We'll be sending out all of the PowerPoints. We'll be sending out participant lists with emails and also the background papers. And just because you weren't here when I thanked you before, Gigi, you're going to be thanked again. Gigi and Julie and Andrea have been really key to putting today together.